If you've ever heard someone say enterprise architect, cloud engineer, same thing, right? You're not alone. And if you've ever looked at an HR written job description for, say, a cloud architect and realized the job description is a cloud engineer job description, not a cloud architect job description, you're not alone. So today what we're going to do is we're going to clear this up. If you've ever heard someone say enterprise architect, cloud engineer, same thing, right? You're not alone. And if you've ever looked at an HR written job description for, say, a cloud architect and realized the job description is a cloud engineer job description, not a cloud architect job description, you're not alone. So today what we're going to do is we're going to clear this up because the confusion is real. The difference between, say, cloud architecture and cloud engineering, or enterprise architecture versus, say, cloud architecture. And it affects people's careers. It affects hiring decisions. And ultimately, it's keeping people from getting to these goals. So by the end of this video, you'll be able to nail it down to a sentence or two. Why we need enterprise architecture, why we need cloud architecture, why we need cloud engineers, and why they all matter. Let's start with the simplest way to differentiate engineering versus architecture before we get into architecture. Engineering builds. Architecture decides. So we architects determine what should be built, why we're building it, if we're going to build it at all, what trade-offs did we consider along the way, and how whatever our architecture is or our strategy is, how will that get the organization to their goals. Meanwhile, the engineers, like a cloud engineer, super valuable people also, and we definitely need them, are focused about how do I implement that architecture? How do I configure the systems? How do I deploy the systems? How do I operate it? And potentially even how to troubleshoot it when it breaks. So you see that architecture of what do we build, why we do it is very critical, but that cloud engineering or network engineering or software engineering that others do is also valuable. It's just different. And that's the key to remember is an architect is not a senior implementer. So if you really look at architecture, and I've worked in every kind of architecture job you can imagine over the last 25 years, architects are really consultants. And whether it was when I worked as a business architect or a management strategy consultant, and when in that role you're basically optimizing business architectures and optimizing our organizational strategy to create competitive advantage, that's one kind of architecture. We enterprise architects tend to spend more of our time aligning business strategy along with the organization's people, optimizing the key way organizations do things or the processes along the way, and then finding the best technology to support that business's needs. That's enterprise architecture. But you know what? We could be a security architect too, for example, and that security architect would be creating a security blueprint in order to protect the organization, its assets, and its people. So architecture is a business role. Yes, we need technical knowledge, but it's primarily a business role. We don't really touch the keyboard for anything other than writing Word documents, for example, or PowerPoint presentations, or Excel spreadsheets, or emails, or maybe draw some graphics here or there. We plan, we analyze, we recommend. And much like any other consultant, we have to also convince the client or sell the architecture to their client. And that means we need to communicate with key stakeholders, the C-suite, and in most cases, or many cases, even the board of directors, especially if you're an enterprise architect or a business architect, because that's who's going to determine who's going to give you the funding, but also who's going to give you the people power to actually do it. And there's a cost to that too, the human capital. So here's why I think the confusion exists after being an architect for 25 years. And yes, there's real confusion. Some cases, titles get diluted. For example, one company made me an offer to be a network architect, a consulting systems architect many years ago. And when I got there, they said, well, Mike, we're only calling it an architect so we could pay you more. We want you to work as an engineer. So I left and I went to took another architecture job within a few days. But the key is that happens too. Sometimes titles just get diluted. Certification culture. Oh, that's another thing because a lot of the cloud providers, for example, have architect exams and certifications that have nothing to do with architecture. Now, these certifications are great if you want to be an engineer, like a cloud engineer. And these certifications are about, for example, how do I configure the systems on the cloud? How do I deploy them? Which buttons do I click, for example? How do I write an infrastructure as code script? How to set up an EC2 instance, for example, on AWS, or even how to wire up the things. But that's the how-to stuff. That's the cloud engineering work, and we don't do any of that. Instead, we focus on how does the technology work at the systems level. How does that technology, the network technology, what kind of links do we have? What kind of speed are these links, for example? What kind of routing protocols are they using? How are they designed? Do we have any traffic engineering on the network? And how does that work, for example, long before put servers and things on there? We have to understand that, for example. And obviously, you learn it. It's no big deal. We can all learn these things, but you have to understand how things work. Now, we also have to look at a technology as, well, this is a cool thing, but is that going to help us? If it's not going to help the business, we don't use it. So we're looking at constantly looking at a portfolio of technologies to say this will give us a competitive advantage. Let's investigate potentially how it would fit in. Now, we architects, just like physicians, are all about evaluating trade-offs. I promise you, once you start working as an architect, you will find that there's nothing that's perfect. Everything that you actually look at will give you some of what you want and some of what you don't want. And at the end of the day, we architects make the recommendations. Given these trade-offs, we think this is the best one for your business for reasons 1, 2, and 3. This other option exists, but it's got these weaknesses, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and only these 2 strengths. And we're constantly focused on reducing risk. And we constantly have to adjust and constantly justify investments. So it gets more complicated. So if you look at cloud is broad, really. Cloud touches networking, identity, storage, compute, security, data, apps, operations, cost management, governance, everything. So a lot of companies just slap cloud titles on just about anything. But if you think about it, enterprise architecture, enterprise-wide, every part of the business, the people, the processes, the technology. That's enterprise architecture. Now, cloud architecture, that's different. That's focused on the cloud. And that could be cloud platform-wise. It could be solution-wise, and I'll talk a little more than that. Or it could even be, team-wide. So we'll get into that. And job descriptions blur the scope constantly because in most cases, job descriptions are written by HR who have never done the job, who truly don't know what an architect is. It would be no different than you writing a job for a cardiothoracic surgeon. You write the job description about a job that you've never had before and really don't know what they do. So enterprise architecture, like I said, is about the whole technology. So when I say people, I mean the organization's employees. And even how the customers would access the system. When I say processes, I'm talking about the way the company does things. Maybe you've got 2 sales reps. One sales rep sells $1 billion a year and the other one sells $1 million. We should figure out how that sales rep sells the $1 billion and have everybody else learn to do it that way, for example, if it's the process that's the key. The technology. What technology are we using? Now, when they used to come up with these frameworks of people, processes, and technology, they were thinking of things like compute and storage and networking, what have you. Now, technology also includes AI agents and other human-like factors that we need to think about, too, in all of our enterprise architecture. So as enterprise architects, we're accountable for questions like this. What capabilities must we build to win in our market? And that means business capabilities. What should we standardize on, or what should we allow our teams to choose? What are we going to not fund so we can fund this future investment? How do we reduce risks but still increase the speed of changes and enhancements? What's the real target state? What's the roadmap, and how do we get there? That's enterprise architecture. So enterprise architecture artifacts are things like capability maps and target operational models and principles and standards, multi-year roadmap, architecture, decision records, and even investment recommendations. And our audience as enterprise architects is typically the CIO or the CTO or the CFO or the Chief Information Security Officer or the COO, Chief Operating Officer, and a lot of times the CEO and the board. So we enterprise architects live its strategy, figuring out the best way the business can actually work in the future and the technology to support those needs. Now, let's get deeper into cloud architecture. Now, to be fair, cloud architecture does have a few legitimate meanings, depending upon how you would call it. We ultimately have cloud platform architecture, and that is the entire cloud foundational blueprint that we can think of. People in this world are focused on landing zones and network design and identity and access management and security controls and governance and shared services and cost management platforms and observability and resilience. That's really the real cloud architecture work when we talk about architecture in general broad scope. Now, there are some people that get a little more technical in their roles. They're still not touching the technology, but they're more technical. Now, we might have a cloud solutions architect that is typically workload focused as opposed to platform focused, which is everything. Now, the solutions architect might be asking the questions of how should this application run in the cloud. The cloud solutions architect might be thinking about which services should we use and why. The cloud solutions architect might be focused on how do we design for scale, reliability, security, and cost. And they might be even thinking, how do we integrate these systems, these cloud systems, with other enterprise systems? So this role itself is a little closer to a delivery team, but it's still architecture because it's decision-making, it's patterns and trade-offs. Now, the other kind of architect you might find in the cloud architect world is more of a cloud adoption architect or more on the cloud strategy architects. And these architects focus on the migration approach. And they typically focus on modernization strategies and operating model changes and skills and organizational readiness and vendor strategy. Now, any of these can still fit into cloud architecture. And many of these jobs wear 2 or 3 of these hats at the same time. Some of them do. Some of the time. Unless you become very senior in the role, and then obviously it's going to be one of these hats. So, to kind of drill it in, the cloud engineer says, I can build that VPC. I will deploy your Kubernetes cluster. I will set up your data pipelines. The cloud architect would say, here's the landing zone design. Here's your identity model. Here's your network segmentation. Here are your security guardrails. And here's the approved patterns for workloads. Now, the enterprise architect would say, okay, you said we're going to the cloud. Why do we want to go to the cloud? What business outcomes are we targeting? What capabilities do we need to change? Product delivery, security operations, finance, cost, governance. What's the operating model? What are the trade-offs in the vendor strategy? And what's the roadmap? So I hope you can feel the difference. Cloud architecture is, realistically speaking, in many cases a subset of enterprise architecture, but it's more focused on just the cloud. Whereas enterprise architecture is big, the entire system, business, technology, everything moves together. So that's kind of why most architects, like a cloud architect, enterprise architect, security architect, AI architect, we're all unique individuals. Because a good architect, a strong architect, will have good, strong technical knowledge about what options exist, how the various technologies work, how the various technologies integrate, the gotchas and the mistakes that you don't want to make, combined with executive skills like influence, communication, stakeholder alignment, transformational leadership, that kind of thing. Because we architects don't win by being right. Architects win by getting the organization aligned behind the right decisions that give that organization a competitive advantage. So it's more about, for us as architects, any architect really, enterprise architect, cloud architect, it's about managing stakeholders. It's about giving presentations and communicating things. It's about building business cases. It's about responding to documents like RFPs. It's about evaluating vendors objectively. Realizing that there's no perfect vendor, no vendor has the best solutions. We have to evaluate what's best for us given the trade-offs between all the options in a fair and unbiased manner. We focus on reducing risk. That's architecture. So here's a quick filter you can use anytime you see architect in a title to try to interpret what the job really is, since there's so much confusion about architecture. The first thing you want to ask is, what's the scope? The scope will tell you a lot. The next thing you want to ask is, what are the decision rights in this position? Do you set direction or do you take direction? Often architects set direction. Who's the audience? If we're working towards engineers, that is more of an engineering job. But if the audience is senior leadership, it's an architect job most likely. Then we can see, what do we do in our job? If they want us to produce roadmaps or reference architectures or business cases, chances are it's an architecture job. If they want you to create a Terraform script, it's a cloud engineering job. How is success measured? If it's an architect job, it'll be things like risk reduction, cross control, better business outcomes. If it's engineering, it's going to be about tech things. So the next time someone says enterprise architect, cloud architect, security architect, cloud engineer, security engineer, all the same thing, you can explain why they're somewhat related, but they're not identical. You will understand that enterprise architecture aligns the enterprises to key business outcomes, while cloud architecture focuses on the designs of the cloud and solution patterns to make those business outcomes possible. And if you want to learn how to build a real architecture career, don't just learn tools. Learn decision making, learn communication, learn stakeholder leadership, and the business side of digital transformation. I hope this video helped you better understand architecture. If it did, I want to invite you to an architecture webinar. And on these architecture webinars, we'll go over the role of the architect, whether it be a cloud architect or a security architect or an AI architect or an enterprise architect. We'll talk about all the skills you need to get your first architect job for any of those roles that I talked about, like an enterprise architect. We'll talk about how to stand out, how to get employers to come to you, and even how to win the interview by telling you what hiring managers want and other things on these free architecture webinars. These architecture webinars are on Zoom. We can have a face-to-face conversation. I'll answer any architecture career questions you have. So please register for one of these architecture webinars in the description of this video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell to be notified of new videos that will assist you in your cloud architect career, enterprise architect career, security architect career, or any other architect career. This is Mike Gibbs signing off for now. I'll see you in another architect video or an architect webinar real soon.